Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateachershistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateachershistory, or shoot me an email, chris@ateachershistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello, class. Welcome to A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me today. Did you know Valley Forge was in the middle of one of the most fertile farming areas in the colonies, even though it is infamous for the lack of food and supplies in the winter of 1778? That during this winter, many notable revolutionaries began to openly doubt the leadership of George Washington, and that a Prussian captain named Baron Frederick von Steuben played a critical role in providing the necessary training for Washington's troops and helped to improve the morale in camp. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we will learn that and more in episode 65, Winter at Valley Forge. Hello everyone, welcome into episode 65. The Winter at Valley Forge. Real quick, just to get this out of the way, my book recommendation for this week is one that I read probably 5 years ago, really liked it, and actually refer back to it for a couple things in this episode. It is American Creation, Triumphs and Tragedies in the Founding of the Republic by Joseph Ellis. Really good look at very specific events throughout the Revolutionary period and into the early founding of the country. And I would highly recommend it. And then he has a chapter on Valley Forge in the winter of 1777 and 1778. Last week, we covered the enormous victory for the American forces at Saratoga, and I had planned on diving a bit deeper into the alliance with France and the subsequent diplomatic efforts in the war and the expansion of the war really into a European war. But upon further review, it seemed to make more sense to put that on the shelf for a week and focus on the next event in the chronological timeline of the Revolution, and that is the winter camp of 1777 and 1778 at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. So prior to the Battle of Brandywine, which we covered 2 episodes ago in episode 63, Valley Forge had been pegged as a pretty good spot for the Revolutionary Army, the Continental Army, to store supplies. After the British victory at Brandywine, the Hessian general Knyphausen, the same man who commanded the central forces in the Battle of Brandywine, set his sights on Valley Forge and was determined to raid the American supplies, trying to limit their ability to recover following their loss. In spite of the best efforts by both Alexander Hamilton and Henry Lee, the Crown soldiers captured supplies, destroyed some others, and burned down a few of the buildings on the site. By the end of October, following the losses at Brandywine and Germantown, Washington knew that his forces were in desperate need of rest and recuperation. Unfortunately, they had lost hold of the city of Philadelphia. Knowing that their winter quarters would likely leave a lot to be desired when comparing to the British quarters in Philadelphia, Washington and his men put their heads together to try to determine what their next steps would be. The Continental Army, considering all desires from the officers to the men in the ranks and the politicians holed up in York, Pennsylvania, were determined to stay on the outskirts of Philly, at least initially, trying to prevent the British from ravaging the countryside and seeing if there was an opportunity to gain an upper hand on the British prior to camping for the winter. In the first week of December, Howe determined that, he just wasn't satisfied with those victories at Brandywine and Germantown, and he was going to try to ruin Washington's plans once and for all and engage him in battle prior to the winter. and this was in a little-known Battle of White Marsh. This battle, which was more or less a series of skirmishes, was inconclusive, and Howe eventually withdrew, retiring for the winter in Philadelphia. Howe's withdrawal into Philadelphia allowed Washington to then eventually plan a more permanent encampment for the winter, but he wasn't particularly happy about it. Following White Marsh, Washington wrote to Congress that, quote, "I sincerely wish that they had made an attack. The issue, in all probability, from the disposition of our troops and the strong situation of our camp, would have been fortunate and happy. At the same time, I must add that reason, prudence, and every principle of policy forbade us quitting our post to attack them. Nothing but success would have been justified the measure, and this could not be expected from their position." But knowing that it was not time to keep rehashing woulda, shoulda, coulda, Washington and his men marched the 13-mile journey to Valley Forge to camp for what would be a very rough winter. Now, at first blush, this was a great location for the Americans, at least geographically. It has high terrain, which would make an enemy approach very difficult. In addition to this, the proximity to Philadelphia made it easy to detach men to roam and try to protect the countryside around the city. And it was right on the river, so supplies, at least in theory, could be transported, and there was more than enough room to run drill and train operations. The best part about camping at Valley Forge, it was in the heart of fertile farming lands, which leads me to one of the central ironies about this starving time, that winter. And this is something we'll cover in more detail in just a few minutes. So after sending some of his men to Trenton, New Jersey to camp and others to Wilmington, Delaware for the winter, Washington began to set up camp with the large majority of his men, about 12,000 of them, in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. There were so many men here. This would have actually been the 5th largest settlement in the colonies if it were a permanent settlement, behind cities like Boston, New York, Philly, and Baltimore. This was the first large-scale construction effort for the colonial forces, seeing as many as 1,500 log huts built on the grounds. These huts varied in their construction and effectiveness. They were pretty depressing, with the Marquis de Lafayette noting that they were, quote, "small barracks, which are scarcely more cheerful than dungeons." Once these huts were established and the men began to settle in, though, it got real quick. Because of all the fighting surrounding Philadelphia in the fall of 1777, like Brandywine and Germantown, the supply lines around the city had more or less broken down, leaving Washington with the task of figuring out how to supply a camp that was the size of a small city. And by small, I mean actually a pretty big city. To make matters worse, the road conditions in the winter were brutal, making any regular supply train basically impossible. Oh, and I mentioned that the river had more or less frozen over, making that not reliable either. The lack of reliable supply for the men made their ability to be supplied proper rations a pipe dream. The lack of available food led to some significant starvation for some of them, but no one made out as bad as the horses. With perishable foods rotting before reaching camp, confusion about their whereabouts, or captured supplies by the enemy, the men began to suffer from severe hunger in some cases, while seeing about 1,500 horses starve to death. Because of these lack of options, the soldiers often had to resign to eating fire cake, which is gross. It was just flour mixed with water, cooked over a fire. I've had it before, and you can trust me when I say it was nothing to write home about. Joseph Plum Martin, a Continental soldier, seemed to agree with me, writing that, quote, "to go into the wild woods and build us habitations to stay in such a weak, starved, and naked condition was appalling in the highest degree." Washington echoed Martin's sentiments, writing that, quote, "to see men without clothes to cover their nakedness, without blankets to lay on, without shoes, by which their marches might be traced by the blood from their feet, and almost as often without provisions as with, marching through frost and snow, is a mark of patience and obedience, which, in my opinion, can scarce be paralleled." Ouch. Not a ringing endorsement for Valley Forge. No surprise about 1/10 of the men in camp deserted. But hold on a second. Didn't I mention earlier that Valley Forge was smack in the middle of one of the most fertile areas in the country? How could conditions possibly be this bad? I think Gouverneur Morris put it best when he lamented the reality that, quote, an American army in the bosom of America is about to disband for the want of something to eat? Well, the biggest problem wasn't the lack of crops available, but instead the lack of crops available to the Continental Army. Let me explain. Many of the farmers in this region were still operating in a somewhat free market. Therefore, they could sell their goods to the British Army in Philadelphia down the road or to the Continental forces. As you can imagine, many of them were torn on what to do with their produce, having to balance the reality of providing goods to the enemy and also looking out for their and their families' welfare. William Stewart, an officer on patrol duty, noted that, quote, I can assure your excellency, not less flour is sufficient to maintain 8,000 or 10,000 men goes daily to Philadelphia. And scarcely a day passes, but a number gets into that place by the different roads on this side of the river. Because, see, the British Army could pay in pounds sterling for these goods, whereas the Continental Army could only pay in notes that were basically like IOUs, with the promise that they would be paid back. Probably. I mean, maybe. That is, if these colonies are able to defeat the most powerful army in the world. So, probably not. You can understand why the farmers were likely to sell to the British. But, yeah, the British also weren't going to rest on their laurels, making sure that they began to travel the countryside and strongly recommend that the farmers sell their goods and livestock to the British Army. Eventually, the Continental Army began to do the same thing, and the countryside scavenging Cold War began to break out between the two sides, with the Continental Army often finding out that the British troops had beat them to the punch. Washington wrote that, quote, unless some great and capital change suddenly takes place in that line, this army must inevitably be reduced to one or other of these three things: starve, dissolve, or disperse, in order to obtain subsistence in the best manner they can. As the year turned to 1778, the men continued to suffer. While the winter wasn't particularly cold for that period or for that location, whenever you're suffering a winter without supplies, proper clothing, lodging, or food, I would think it would be pretty understandable why even pretty cold weather would make you beyond miserable. Years later, the Marquis de Lafayette recalled that, quote, the unfortunate soldiers were in want of everything. They had neither coats, hats, shirts, nor shoes. Their feet and legs froze till they had become almost black, and it was often necessary to amputate them. On January 24th, when a congressional delegation arrived at camp, they were pretty shocked to see the conditions. See, the soldiers' conditions were kept under wraps for a variety of reasons, and unless you saw just how bad it was likely hard to believe. The hospital records show that things had gotten so bad, only a few thousand men were actually fit for duty during the winter if any fighting actually did break out. After this delegation visited, the Continental Army began to reorganize their supplies, putting the great Nathaniel Greene in charge of them, which, no battlefield commander is really happy about being put on administrative duty, but he recognized how important it was. So Washington placed him as quartermaster, which was showing to everyone that, hey, this supply line organization stuff, this is a big deal, and it might just be the biggest threat to my army. But the food shortage wasn't the only issue that the colonists had to deal with. Scabies, or the 7-year itch, became prevalent in camp. This is super gross, and if you'd like to find out more about it, feel free to Google it. All I can say is that you don't want it, and you definitely don't want it when you barely have any clothes or real medical care in the middle of winter. Did I mention that the men also were barely able to bathe? They had little to no clean water for cooking. Oh, and the carcasses of those 1,500 horses were just laying in the middle of camp rotting away. And since the old germ theory hadn't been discovered yet, pretty important, they really had no idea what to do to try to combat these issues. Because of this, outbreaks of typhoid, flu, pneumonia, typhus, and body lice ravaged some of the regimental camps. Dr. Benjamin Rush noted that, quote, "There cannot be a greater calamity for such men to come into our hospitals at this season of the year. I assert that the great majority of those who die under our hands perish with diseases caught in our hospitals." It is believed that upwards of 2,000 men died from the lack of supplies and illness. That means more men died during the winter at Valley Forge than in any battle of the Revolution. So you can see why I'm taking time to talk about it in its own episode. In a very bold maneuver, Washington actually ordered his men inoculated with the smallpox germ, which was helpful in curbing the impact of the disease on his men and also shows a pretty progressive approach to medical treatment during the late 18th century. Surprisingly, some of the soldiers' hopes and morale was buoyed by their families joining them at camp. It was estimated that there were possibly a few hundred women who followed their significant other to the Valley Forge encampment. Washington wrote that, quote, "The multitude of women in particular, especially those who are pregnant or have children, are a clog upon every movement." So, maybe they weren't that helpful. In the end, though, many of these women were very helpful. They did laundry, they took care of sick soldiers, and like I said, the morale alone improved with them being there. And Washington can complain all he wants, but by all accounts, the presence of his wife, Martha Washington, was one of the biggest reasons why George was able to get through the winter with the positive attitude that he did. After joining the men, shortly after the new year, Martha spent the rest of the winter and spring managing the domestic staff, supporting her husband George, and lending a hand with the care and provision of the troops. What may also be surprising to you is the ethnic diversity that existed in Valley Forge. About 30% of the soldiers at Valley Forge did not speak English as their first language, with men speaking a variety of languages such as German, Scottish, Irish Gaelic, French, and Dutch. In addition to this, Native Americans and blacks also participated in the Army, with almost 10% of Washington's troops being African Americans. For the most part, the men here at Valley Forge were indentured servants, immigrants, emancipated slaves, the third or fourth son of a family, so he's not getting any land and doesn't really have any other option. They were mostly not from the wealthy or stable social environments. They were the poorest in America. See, the wealthier soldiers, they fought for the state militias, not the Continental Army. Another issue that befell the officers in the Continental Army were the organizational challenges that they faced. Many units were disorganized due to years of fighting, the uneven recruitment, and the ever-changing leadership structure. During this winter, Washington reorganized the units, creating more clarity and placing them into 5 different divisions. But while many were supporting Washington and his men, the loyalty to Washington himself was one of the primary reasons why some soldiers were able to deal with the harsh conditions and some really weren't. An anonymous soldier wrote that, quote, "The proper methods of attacking, beating, and conquering the enemy have never as yet been adapted by our Commander Washington." Not a ringing endorsement. Additionally, what we find is he wasn't the only one upset with General Washington. Colonel Pickering noted that, quote, "Before I came to the Army, I entertained an exalted opinion of General Washington's military talents, but I have since seen nothing to enhance it." Heck, even John Adams complained that, quote, "We must have another leader. General Washington is no longer able to hold our little army together." Wow. The most notable attempt at subverting the authority of General Washington was nicknamed the Conway Cabal. Led by Thomas Conway, this was an attempt to overthrow Washington's leadership and replace him with Horatio Gates, which, knowing what I know now and what you will soon know about General Horatio Gates, that would have been a scary prospect. While this was likely never the formally organized effort that Washington was always a little bit afraid of, the relationship between Gates and Washington slowly had become more strained. Following the victory at Saratoga, Gates sent his report of the battle directly to Congress instead of Washington, and even had grown frustrated with Washington's attempts to request Gates's men be sent south to assist him against Howe. Most of this cabal was really just a bunch of congressmen and foreign officers and even some American officers not thinking highly of Washington, and Conway himself petitioning for his own promotion and knocking Washington down in the process to make him seem more qualified. While Gates was seen as more of a stalking horse to replace Washington, this loss of support, at least temporarily, was hard to ignore. Over time, the leaking of Conway's correspondences and the suppression of this movement helped to reignite the support for Washington, ironically, and his support slowly and regularly improved over time. Because one thing that's valuable to keep in mind when considering this apparent frustration with Washington was his ability to process and handle a threat such as this. He did so, for the most part, with stoicism, professionalism, and grace, even if he was a little bit rankled by the entire affair. Following the drama, Washington pointed out that, hey, I'm not getting paid anything to do this, and this is a pretty big charity that I'm undertaking for this burgeoning country here. I just need to remind you of that. He said, quote, "Whenever the public gets dissatisfied with my services, or a person is found better qualified to answer her expectation, I shall quit the helm with as much satisfaction and retire to private life with as much content as ever the wearied pilgrim felt upon his safe arrival in the Holy Land." And to Washington and his men's credit, many of the officers came to his defense, daring any man to have the courage to publicly cry out against Washington, and some were even willing to die in a duel to defend his honor. Lafayette wrote to Washington, quote, "I wish you could know as well as myself what difference there is between you and any other man among this continent. If you were lost for America, there is nobody who could keep the army and revolution for 6 months." As winter became spring, morale, efficiency, and discipline did begin to improve, thanks in no small part to a new visitor, a man named Baron Frederick Wilhelm von Steuben. Up to this point in the war, the Continental Army was struggling for a variety of reasons, which we have covered, but one of the ones we haven't talked about a lot was their inability to coordinate their organization, their formations, their techniques, and their training. The men in the Army came from all walks of life and all different colonies. They'd been trained locally and would usually be managed or led by their local or regimental commander, who often reinforced that local training. After the Baron von Steuben arrived on February 23rd, he began to whip these soldiers into shape. Eventually, he became solely responsible for the training of the soldiers and improved their formation and techniques, teaching them proper volley fire, improved maneuverability, standardized their march paces, their exercise skirmishing options, and drilled bayonet proficiency, which, by the way, was one of the scariest things for a Continental soldier was when the British charged with their bayonets, because they'd never really been trained on how to handle it or how to use them as defense. So you can imagine why a bunch of guys running directly at you with a sword at the end of their musket would be pretty intimidating. So this is super important because in the 18th century, you need to be able to do this stuff during the heat of battle to adapt to the movements of your enemy and prevent flanking attempts, keep basic cohesion of a unit, and, conduct an effective retreat, which is actually something the Continental Army gotten pretty good at. It was originally believed that von Steuben was a lieutenant general under Frederick the Great, so, people were freaking out. But historians later found out it was a fabricated title. He was likely no higher than a captain, and Benjamin Franklin was the one who probably lied about his resume. Knowing that he could be effective and make big changes, he wanted Washington and his men to take him seriously. So, a little white lie for the betterment of everyone else. No harm, no foul. After entering the camp, von Steuben recognized that it was in disarray and let Washington know just how bad everything was. He decided to take a small group of about 100 men, train them and instill discipline into them, and then send them out to repeat their training to the thousands of other soldiers. While his methods were at times sort of brutal and overly critical, many of the men in camp welcomed the opportunity to be trained by such a disciplined European officer, and over time, von Steuben began to appreciate them too. Von Steuben wrote to a friend that, quote, "With a Prussian soldier, you can tell him, grab that shovel, dig that hole, and he'll do it, no question. You tell an American soldier, and he'll look you in the eye and ask, why?" This curiosity and somewhat seeming indignation by some American soldiers was something that von Steuben respected in them. He liked it. Prior to Valley Forge, it took about 30 seconds to load a musket. By the time he was done with the soldiers, it took about 20. Might not seem like a huge difference, but that is a huge difference. Not surprisingly, morale drastically improved with these efforts. In fact, von Steuben was such an overwhelming success that Washington appointed him to be in charge of all the training and all the logistics for the army moving forward. As winter bled into spring, word of the French alliance with the Americans boosted morale even further. And what we'll see next week is that Washington is going to take his men into battle, like a European mano-a-mano battle, just to see how well his troops could hold up. We'll cover that, the Battle of Monmouth, and the Europeans getting involved in the war next episode. As you pack up your things, I want you to consider sort of the myth and memory of Valley Forge. Because as time has passed following the winter at Valley Forge, it became more of a fixture in American storytelling, and a testament to the steadiness of Washington's leadership and the fortitude and passion of the Continental soldiers. One of the most inaccurate aspects of this story regards the weather that the soldiers endured, because usually when you see depictions of the Valley Forge winter, it has men freezing under awful conditions, like buried in snow, the camp blanketed with snow, and temperatures unbearably low, like you can imagine them in the single digits. But that wasn't likely the case. It was likely a pretty mild Philadelphia winter with temperatures often above freezing with a little bit of snow and ice. Maybe. Why do we think it was so cold then? Well, the winter of 1779-1780 was reportedly a really cold winter, like one of the coldest winters in the entire 18th century. And stories and images of that winter likely seeped into the American conscious at Valley Forge over time. One last myth, and one that I didn't even mention here or give really any respect to because I think it's just totally made up, but worth mentioning here at the end. It's a popular story that when things were really bad, Washington went out to the woods to pray for the salvation of his army. And shortly thereafter, things began to turn around, and von Steuben arrived, and morale was raised, and everyone lived happily ever after. While it certainly could have happened, it likely didn't, considering George Washington's religious beliefs, and there was never an eyewitness to this event. Sort of seems to fall into the same category of Washington chopping down the cherry tree and never telling a lie. As I mentioned, next week we'll dive deeper into the European powers who decide to get involved in this war, following the Americans' valiant efforts at Germantown and Saratoga, and check in to see how Washington's doing in battle after their difficult winter at Valley Forge. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.